So in my last video, I talked about why I was in some ways regretting purchasing the 16-inch fully loaded M1 Max MacBook Pro. And for the most part, that was because the diminishing returns in performance that you get when you're spending $4,000 on a laptop. But one thing that I touched on was the size of this thing. I think that has been a pretty clear drawback that a lot of reviewers have touched on. The 16-inch MacBook Pro is a chunky boy. There is no doubt about that. I mean, this thing is massive, and it doesn't even fit on an airplane. You cannot put it on a tray table and open up the display. So for some people, this is totally out of the question, and that's why I actually tend to prefer the 14-inch form factor. But that got me thinking, what if there was something that took advantage of the best of both of these, that was somewhere in the middle? And then I was like, wait a minute, Apple used to make that. It's right here. It's the 15-inch MacBook Pro. So I set aside both of these MacBooks here. I said, okay, out with the new and in with the old. I'm going back to Intel. So, welcome to my 15-inch 2019 MacBook Pro. This is the most powerful of the old design. And I'm not counting the 16-inch because that was sort of halfway in between. And the reason that this video was so interesting to me was specifically because of the 15-inch MacBook Pro. I think when the 16-inch, the new one, the M1 Pro, M1 Max model came out, most people compared it to the previous 16-inch, which launched in November 2019. And that makes a lot of sense, but that model was slightly larger, thicker, and heavier than the 15-inch, and the new one is in turn slightly larger and heavier and thicker than the old 16-inch. So when you actually look at the 15-inch MacBook Pro with the 2016 to 2019 design, and you compare it to the new 16-inch, the difference in size is really, really noticeable. I wouldn't say it's the difference between a tiny laptop and a large laptop, but it is the difference between a medium-sized laptop and a chunky boy, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, this is decidedly a very thin and relatively light laptop given what it was at the time, which was, an extremely high power device. Now, the same could not exactly be said for it now, to make things perfectly clear. This MacBook Pro, as we'll dive into, is not exactly going to be able to rival the new ones in terms of its performance. But what I was really interested in is the form factor, really. This is a design that was scorned by many. We, of course, have the touch bar. That is its own thing. The freaking butterfly keyboard. I don't think there's anyone out there who says, oh, I prefer the butterfly keyboard. And if you are out there, why? Explain yourself. Put that in the comments. I want to know how your brain works. But when we set aside the poor thermals, the butterfly keyboard, the touch bar, and you look at this as a package, it's actually quite appealing. I'm not going to lie. This design is 6 years old. Came out in 2016. And I have to say, apart from the bezels, which do date it somewhat, it looks really, really good. Even if you ignore the fact that the butterfly keyboard is like a nervous twitch for me, it's a really attractive design, and I think, is this the perfect form factor? Could Apple bring it back and obviously improve on it by fixing all of the flaws that made this generation so detestable? Well, after spending a couple of days back on Intel, I have a lot of thoughts about this machine. Now, this is, or was, a very, very expensive laptop. It's almost 3 years old now, but when this thing came out in May of 2019, holy moly was this expensive. I've got the 2.4 gigahertz upgraded Core i9. I've got the 32 gigabytes of RAM upgrade, and I also have 1 terabyte of storage, which was an upgrade. You had to pay for that, over $512. So this thing, when it was new, cost $3,899, actually the exact same amount that I spent on my fully decked out M1 Max MacBook Pro, which also has a terabyte, but 64 gigabytes of RAM, and of course the M1 Max, which is much more powerful. But how much more powerful? Well, let's go through it pretty quickly. In some CPU tests such as Geekbench 5 Multicore and Cinebench R23, the new machines absolutely stomp all over this Core i9. The 15-inch MacBook Pro is really more on par with an M1 MacBook in these cases. It's not even close, and that applies in single core as well, where Apple Silicon has huge leads. But the performance gains that Apple has brought to the MacBook show themselves even more clearly when we look at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where the 3-year-old $4,000 machine can only get 25 FPS, whereas the M1 Max, which is running this in Rosetta, can pull 97. Even the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M1 Pro can pull 55 FPS here. So it really does show you how far behind Apple used to be. Even when we move over to Blender, Classroom, and BMW, this is a test that isn't particularly performant on Apple Silicon. Apple Silicon doesn't run Blender all that well, but we're still creaming this older Core i9 MacBook Pro. For some real-world tests in Final Cut Pro, it's more of the same. The M1 Pro and the M1 Max absolutely annihilate Intel in the render as well as the export for a 10-minute 4K 60 FPS 10-bit clip. And in DaVinci Resolve, it's an absolute bloodbath, cutting down our export times for a 3-minute clip from just under 4 minutes to under 40 seconds. In every single test, the new MacBooks dumped all over this $4,000 laptop from 2.5 years ago. It's not even close. In fact, I made a video last year where I put this thing up against the M1 chip, and the M1 chip was on par or better in really most of the tests. So Apple clearly has some work to do catching up with the latest stuff that Intel, AMD, and Nvidia is putting out. But in terms of what Apple was putting out just a few years ago, my goodness, things are so much better now. And as a result of that, the residual values for these MacBooks are in the toilet. Fortunately for me, I didn't pay $38.99 for this MacBook Pro because of one of the things that annoys me so much about this generation, the butterfly keyboard. I actually bought the 2016, the first of this design, and I had so many keyboard failures that the Apple Store gave me this computer for free, brand new, back in 2019. So yeah, that gives you an idea of just where we're starting from. So how has my week or so with this MacBook Pro been? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the performance really is not that great, but to be honest, for the past week or so, I haven't done a ton of super performance intensive things. Nothing that would really saturate an M1 Max. So that hasn't been as much of an issue. This has been more light computing. There's no other way to say it. I like this design. I think it is a great overall form factor, and I think Apple should bring it back. Now, I don't think Apple should replace what they've just given us in the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. Those designs are going to be here almost unchanged probably for another 4 or 5 years. So don't expect Apple to be walking that back anytime soon. But I would really like to see a laptop that fits in this category. So it really got me thinking, what if Apple made a 15-inch MacBook Air? We've got the 14-inch, we've got the 16-inch for pros, but if you aren't a pro, if you don't need that kind of horsepower, it would be kind of nice to have a casual browsing computer that also had a large display. And that's what this is. This isn't a powerhouse anymore. It was, or at least it tried to be in 2019, but now it's, as I mentioned, it's an M1 that overheats, essentially. The fans on this thing, don't even get me started on it. But if Apple were to make a device like this, that were obviously updated with the new design cues. Maybe a slightly thinner package, because obviously you wouldn't need it to be this thick if you're just putting like an M1 or an M2 chip in it. It would also be slightly smaller in footprint because you would be able to shrink these bezels around a 15-inch display. Obviously, we'd get rid of the touch bar, get rid of the butterfly keyboard, and go to the keyboard that we have gotten used to since it was replaced in 2019, the Magic keyboard. The more I think about that device, the more I think it might be my ideal MacBook. I'm a big fan of screen real estate. I was super pumped when I was able to go from my iPhone 5 to an iPhone 6 Plus. I was pumped when that became an iPhone XS Max, and then when that got even larger for an iPhone 12 Pro Max. Those were great upgrades. I was like, I want the biggest one possible. But what I would really like to see is a device with a large screen that has as small of a footprint as possible. Getting that perfect blend between a high-resolution screen with lots of room on it and a device that can very easily slip into my backpack. Now, granted, in the Intel days, the trade-offs that Apple gave us to get to this design, the keyboard, the thermals, were not worth it. But now, with Apple Silicon, those trade-offs aren't necessary. You don't have to sacrifice thermal performance to get a thin and light design. Just look at the M1 MacBook Air. It doesn't even have a fan. Imagine what Apple could do with a 15-inch fanless design. That would be incredible. And I really, really, really would like to see it. So I'm curious to know what you guys think. Do you think the 16-inch MacBook Pro is a little bit too big? Would you go for a 15-inch MacBook Air? I mean, I'm just imagining like a $1,600 M2 15-inch MacBook Air. It would be slightly smaller than this in its footprint, in its dimensions, in its weight. Probably more powerful with a 15-inch display. That's the perfect MacBook for me. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And as usual, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.